used to be fun because I'd go and I was, back in the day, I was a threefer because I was a woman, a layperson, and a person of color. And we'd send church delegations, and they're always, of course, all white male, usually bald. Also.
Yes.
So I got to go to lots of places that probably I had no business going, that there were others who, by their status and their position and all, were probably should have been chosen to go, but I was chosen because I was a threefer. So I got to go to lots of places that were fun and interesting, and I found out that I loved to travel. First began reopening conversations between the Russian government finally allowed the church to travel.
Right.
And so that the very first, I forget what it was, it has this really, really long title, something, but so that was the very first international conference that was hosted by the Russian Church, and so it was a really big deal. And I got to go because I'm always selected to go to those kinds of meetings. So I have done lots, lived a long time, so I've done lots of things. My grandmother, I was a first grandchild, and my grandmother just doted on me and took me every place. We'd go to tea with her friends, and she was so proud of her first grandchild. And of course, I was precocious, and I chattered in whole sentences. And so one of my earliest memories is visiting with her, and in the traditional Japanese style, they'd have the little cushions on the floor, and they'd kneel on the cushions and sit and drink tea. And so I remember doing that, and I loved my grandma because she just doted on me so much. Yes, I was born in Fresno. My mother was born in Fresno, and my grandparents came from Japan to California in, I want to say, 1892.
Wow.
That was a long...
Do you know that story?
Yes, on both sides of my family, the grandfathers came back in the contract labor days when they went to Hawaii to, pick pineapples and sugarcane and coffee and stuff. And then they went to Seattle and worked on the railroad. And after he finished his contract, I suppose, then he came down the coast. And so my family's been here for a long time. I always enjoy people who ask me, and so when did you come to California? Or when did you? And then we moved because of World War II, when all Japanese American families were ordered to leave the West Coast. My uncle had a business in Minnesota, and so we were able to not go into those concentration camps that the government ordered the Japanese families to go to from the West Coast, and moved to Minnesota. So my childhood years, I spent in Minnesota, and
Did you have friends and family who were in the concentration camps?
Yes.
So you knew that was going on.
Oh yeah.
Even though your experience was very different.
No, because my father, at the time when the government orders were obviously coming to go to the camps, decided that he wanted a better option for our family. And so he had to apply for permission from the government to travel, because you weren't supposed to be out on the highways. And I still have the letter of permission from the government, which I always think is interesting because it's dated July 4th, 1942.
Wow. A lot of Japanese Americans, when they came home, didn't have a home to come back to, because while they were locked up, other people had taken over their homes, sometimes taken over their churches, their businesses. And your story was a little bit different than that. What was it that happened while you all were gone?
Well, we had friends, very good friends who were Russian German, I guess. So in a way that's a little bit ironic. The Japanese leave and the Germans stay. Who offered to manage and take care of the family business, which was a chicken hatchery at that time. And very luckily for our family, they really were good friends and did what they said they would do. And when our family came back, turned the business back over to our family. So we had the family home, which had never been sold because the German family lived there. But we were, as I say, we were very, very lucky in that we did have a place to come home to. But my father says things were so difficult.
Well, related to all of this, you grew up in predominantly white farming country as a Japanese American girl. I've heard you talk about how, for the most part, you didn't feel like people treated you as less than. You felt like you still had a lot of opportunities. Why would that have been the case?
I think it was my grandma.
Yeah.
To that very early shaping, and the sense of being somebody who was worthy and worthy of respect.
So this is skipping around a little bit.
That's
But that's a very good point. You weren't born and raised in the Disciples of Christ. Is that correct?
No, that's really correct.
What were you raised, and how did you become disciples?
So I was raised in the Congregational Church, which later, of course, became the United Church of Christ, right? And I never knew anything about Disciples of Christ. I mean, if anybody had said that to me about a church, I wouldn't have been able to identify it with anything. But it just so happened that my husband was raised Disciples of Christ because his mother was the one who went to a Christian school in Japan. When the government orders came in World War II for people to go into the concentration camps or leave, his family went into the camps. And so then the U.S. military intelligence was looking for people to teach the soldiers Japanese. So he was recruited out of the concentration camp, moved the family to Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the military intelligence school was, to teach soldiers Japanese. Went to Ohio Wesleyan University and then to Chicago to the and so then he said, well, you got accepted to Berkeley, you have to go. And I said, okay.
So you went home and said, David, we're moving.
No, I didn't. I went home and they said, okay, we're moving.
And so this is why he ended up applying to the San Lorenzo Church.
That's right. Because he decided that we were that I was going to school at Berkeley, because that was a good school, and I'd been accepted. And the San Lorenzo Church, probably they were a little bit of a troubled church and having a hard time finding a pastor. That's usually where we went. That's always how he chose us. And so that's how we ended up in San Lorenzo. So I could go to school in Berkeley, and I remember this lovely little tale of one of the women in the church smiling at me and said, we've never put a pastor's wife through law school before. This is fun. So the church supported him, supported me. When I got to law school, I discovered I hated it. Oh, it was so boring. I hated everything. And what could I do? I moved my family, uprooted my family, moved. And so there was no way that I could say, I guess I won't do this. Right. Because there was so much momentum already. And so I just by happenstance took this International Human Rights Law seminar because everything was so awful. And that was a life-changing decision, because it just so happened that the professor of that seminar, decision was a named chair which came with funding, which he chose, instead of spending it on himself or other things, to provide funding for his students to go to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and out to be, as I say, something that I really turned out to like a lot, because I hated law school, the regular stuff at law school, but international human rights law was something that really resonated with me. And he was a pioneer in the field, so we were one of the very first cadre of students who went to Geneva as specifically to learn international human rights law.
Well, and this connects with, I know we usually talk about calling in terms of ordained pastors, but that experience feels like it helped shape your own calling, because I know you say you just kind of stumble from one thing to the other, but you have done so much, following that was connected to human rights and justice, and particularly in the way that you've served in the Disciples. Was it just after graduating from that you ended up moving to Indianapolis?
It was. I had done all of the things that I liked the best in law school were not the kinds of things that would steer you into a corporate law kind of career.
You had effectively made yourself very unemployable. Good job.
That's funny. But anyhow, the Disciples International Affairs executive, after serving a millennium, I suppose, retired just at that time. And so here I am. I've got a law degree, I do international human rights, and the Disciples have now a position open that had been filled by this one man for forever. So I was really an appealing kind of candidate. So I applied, and they said, "Whoa, look at this! Oh, she looks so wonderful. And besides that, she's a woman, and she's Asian, and she's a layperson." And so that's how I got to Indianapolis. Again, my husband was so willing, and we knew nobody in Indiana, and he was a pastor. That's all he knew how to do. and churches in Indiana didn't know him, and he didn't look like the other pastors in Indiana, and so we moved to Indiana without a job for him, and he didn't blink. He said, "You followed me all these, many years," and he says, "It's my turn. I'm going to follow you to Indiana." And he did, because it was an international human rights position that meant that there were a lot of meetings or conferences or trips that went many places in the world, and I'd be gone for a long time, and everybody always took care. And how there were one of the things was not what I did, but what Dave did at our church there in Indianapolis, because from that church during the years he was there, I think 10 women he sent off to seminary.
Yeah.
There always before, the women were in leadership in the church, but always in kind of secondary positions because they didn't have the credentials, and so he was really a person who liked women, wanted women to do well, spoke up for them and encouraged and supported. And I'm pretty sure it was 10 women from that congregation who went to seminary, just because he believed that they were good, deserving, able, and just was able to give them that the necessary kind of the push that got them to think that yes, they could go to seminary. And so he was a wonderful advocate for women, starting with his wife. I never would have on my own gone up and done the things that I did. And they were always, and the church people would always be supportive. And I think we have to give congregation or church people a lot of, or should give them a lot of credit for the role that church people and fellow members of the congregation can give and support for that to happen, because it's still, I think, that little bit extra that women have to do to design.
And I know you never take credit for this. You always give all of the credit to David, but the two of you were also really a big part of getting the North American, what we now call North American Pacific and Asian Disciples, off the ground. There hadn't been any network for Asian and Pacific Islander disciples.
Because there weren't any.
Because there were virtually no disciples who were Asian and Pacific Islander. For a whole bunch of reasons. There had been, and those churches had dealt with a lot of challenges related to immigration laws and a lot of policies along the West Coast that made it hard to get them off the ground. But you and David helped kind of bring the handful that were there together.
Yeah, I think a lot of that credit goes to Harold Johnson.
Right.
That's who it was, who was on the staff at what was DHM at the time? What is it now?
Homeland Ministries at the time.
Homeland Ministries. And so he was so happy when we came. And so he was really a good supporter and kind of always made sure that my name came up for things to do, places to go. Was was kind of he and Dave used to get together and talk about other what to do about Asian disciples and Asians, because there weren't any, and so their first gatherings were like 3 people, because that's all there were.
Right.
And so I always remember that, because now when you go to a gathering of Asian disciples, the room is full and it's overflowing, and they're coming in, and now that there are other the Pacific Asians who are coming, and it's a wonderful thing to see what has happened in history.
I've heard you say that throughout David's ministry in the disciples, you worshipped in white congregations, were well loved and taken care of by members of white disciples' congregations. And when you retired, there was something meaningful about getting to worship for the first time in your adult life in a congregation of people who were Christ followers and of Japanese and Japanese American heritage. Let me ask, with that being true and with you being at a Methodist church, why do you still consider yourself disciples? Why are you still connected with that identity?
Because I am.
And what does that mean? What does it mean to be disciples for you? Why not just be Methodist? Well, but yeah, why disciples?
What I identify as, even in my Methodist church,
I've heard you say it.
Yes,
You let them know you might be worshiping with them, but you're still part of this other thing.
Yes. And the reason I'm at that church is, as we mentioned, that when I moved back to California, I decided that I wanted to be at a church that was part of my family history, with Japanese American, and that through all my adult life I had not been a part of. I grew up in a Japanese congregational church, and when I came back here, disciples, bless us, had no church of my childhood, which is a Japanese American congregation, and because it is a wonderful congregation. It is historically and traditionally Japanese American. We never forget our roots, and yet when you sit in that congregation now, it is very, very diverse. And I joined the church, but I didn't become a Methodist. No. I don't know, but I do. I'm a disciple. I identify as a disciple. And
my sense is it's more than just habit. That's why I'm asking the question. Is there something about the disciples that makes you want to stay there? It could be the relationships, it could be the history, it could be the work you've done. I have no idea.
All of those, probably. But it's just so much a part of me.
And you remain involved in Disciples things. You just stepped off the board of Disciples Divinity House.
Yes.
After 40 years, am I lying?
I don't know. It's so many years. So many years.
More years than that should have been allowed.
Well, I think so.
You've only recently rotated off of the Board of Higher Education and Leadership Ministries. Yes. You remain on the Training and Care Committee for the Northern California, Nevada.
That's true. Yes.
Disciples.
Yes.
Which I think is important to mention, because you had talked about how you and David had mentored up all of these Priscillas. And over the course of his ministry career, I think almost everyone he mentored into ministry was a woman, if I'm remembering the story correctly.
Yes.
And you continue to mentor up young people in ministry to this day. in the disciples, for the disciples?
And, and it's not as though this is a job that I'm going to do, or it's a calling. It just is. It's not as though I have planned my life and pursued these goals. It's just what I am and what I do, and I kind of live in the. I think I live in the moment, and whatever there is for today, or the opportunity, or what I got to do is just in the moment.
So the one last thing I wanted to ask about was what your experience was like being involved with the work of getting reparations for Japanese Americans who had survived the concentration camps here. Because it feels like a continuation of that work that started with the International Human Rights study, and then the work that you did for the disciples around human rights as well. Feels like a natural continuation of that.
Was at a time when I was ready to do something new, and there had always been this position in Washington, D.C. as lobbyist for the Japanese American Citizens League, and then it was a time of when legislation was finally coming to Congress to ask for redress for those Japanese American families who had been removed from their homes and placed in the concentration camps during World War II. And it was at a moment in my life where I was ready to move on to something, and that position in Washington, D.C. Came open, and I was ready to move. And it turned out that all of the things that I had been doing throughout my life were just absolutely perfect preparation for lobbying Congress to get the legislation for funding the redress payments for Japanese Americans. And so I did that, and I was really good. Because there were, it's one senator at a time, getting the grassroots lobbying to support their senators' vote, and because all my life I've been doing things that prepared me for this particular job, which was really a simple job. It was following each senator to lobby them to gain their vote for redress, and then making sure that they knew that their constituents supported them. So you couldn't have, you don't support the senator from Alaska and the senator from Alabama. You support the senator from California. So we needed to get those folks in each of the states to do that, and we had created a network, lobbying network that we could call on. And so, as I say, in that sense, it was a simple job, one senator at a time. Mm-hmm. And it turned, I used to be able to tell you what the vote was, but it was like 70 votes to 20 or something, that we got the senators to vote in favor of funding redress.
And just to clarify, the government had already apologized.
Yes.
Formally. This was about getting the payment. so monetary justice.
Yes.
$20,000
Mhm.
per survivor of the, so you had to have actually
survivor.
lived through it, had been in the camps and still be alive.
That's right.
To qualify.
You're good. That's right.
I'm a nerd. I study these things.
So it was really, not a large number.
Right.
Because you had to be a survivor,
Mm-hmm.
and you couldn't be what do you call it? A descendant.
Descendant, right.
It actually had to have happened to you, and so.
And even so, it wasn't an easy sell.
No, because here you are asking people to support and funding for something that happened 40 years ago. People seem to be doing okay, and and so here there are tragedies happening around you every day, and the hurricane comes, and there are lots of current real
Mm-hmm.
needs, and so why should we be paying much attention to something that happened so long ago, something that a lot of us would just like to either forget or think never happened.
Pretend never happened, yeah.
And so it was not an easy.
Was that part of why you thought it was important to do?
Well, yeah.
I can give you softballs.
And it wasn't, exactly my story, because my family never went into those camps, and so I couldn't be there telling this happened as a first-hand account of what had happened to me. So it was important to be able to get those first-person accounts of what had happened in their lives, and to get them to be strong enough and committed enough to try to get their senators redressed too.
You talked earlier about the importance of acknowledging the good that churches can do, and so this always has me thinking about Martha Inaki Suzuki, who did survive the Japanese American concentration camps. And when they returned to their home church, they discovered it had become all people's Christian church, because they had actually been members of the Japanese Christian church that then went on to become West Adams. And the idea of getting to be a part of a multicultural community of faith meant so much to them that when they eventually got their redress money, they donated it back to all peoples as a way of saying, this is the future we want. This is the community that embraced us at a time when the nation was making us into pariahs. And so for them to take every penny of that money and to put it back into the church, it just strikes me as kind of a symbol of what you had been talking about earlier.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit interesting, I guess, because some people, because they didn't want to remember it, didn't want the money.
That's
either.
Interesting too.
And so, but the things that people did with their redress payments, I think, probably just is the gamut of possibilities, because some put it away for their kids, and some gave it to their church or other charitable interests, and but it's for me, it's so well. It's symbolic isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the government apologized. We're sorry we did that and we won't do it again, which is important because the government doesn't apologize. But then, because in this country, well, lots of countries I suppose, but in a civil situation, if you do something wrong, then there's always a financial component to that. So it was important for that $20,000 token to be realized, because that gave extra gravitas, I guess, to the fact that the government did apologize, that there was this financial symbolic payment with the promise that this should never happen again.
So, I think I've shared with you before, the very first time we met, I had just become a student at Disciples Divinity House at the University of Chicago, and I was feeling very much out of my element. I was feeling like I didn't belong there. I was feeling like everyone there was smarter than I was. I didn't know if I was going to make it through. And I was also very aware of the fact that at that point in time, I was the only Asian American. I was definitely the only Asian American in the ministry program. And there was a DDH board meeting, and the brand new students got invited to join the board for lunch at the Quadrangle Club, which was very fancy. And I sat at a table with you and our friend who was the head of Helm at the time, Dennis Landon, and Chris Dorsey, because he was a brand new PhD student. And I remember the conversation being about minorities in the church, much to Dennis's dismay. And I can't remember what it was that brought the question up, but I said, I'll be honest, with a name spelled like mine, I can't imagine that any Disciples Church is going to be in a rush to hire me and have to put that name on their marquee. I will note, it was right after 9/11. It was literally a month after 9/11. And it was terrifying for me to say that to somebody as high up in the church as Dennis was. And I remember you saying, I think that's a very good point. Dennis, what do you think about that? And it was this beautiful moment. You know, I've joked about how you keep saying you're not really a lawyer, and then every time I interact with you in any institutional setting, you ask all of those really smart, pointed questions, and you always direct them at the right person. And it was this moment where you did, a lot of people without our lived experience would have said, well, that's really sad that you feel that way. What is it that makes you feel, and would have had me continuing to engage that question. And what you did was said, hello, white man in power in an institutional setting. What are you going to do about the fact that this is somebody's lived experience? And at the time, it was just the fact that you supported me that felt good, but the longer I think about that as our first interaction, the more I think about how you were modeling, here's what it looks like to hold institutions accountable instead of adding more burden to the people who are experiencing that marginalization. There have been a million ways that you've impacted me. There are a million ways in which I have learned about the role you've played in advocating for our denominations taking very seriously issues of international human rights issues, from apartheid in South Africa to the rights of trafficked women to everything in between.
I ended global hunger.
You did. It's back. Could you go back and start doing that again?
Brought world peace and ended global hunger. No, that was the mandate for my office.
Yes. And so I'm just struck by the fact that you talk about how, you know, you just kind of stumbled through these things and they happened to you. And I also know that for people who talk about a calling, they talk about how the Holy Spirit presents us with these opportunities that then build on each other, so that each moment in our lives we get to contribute with what God intended for us in that moment. I look on your well-lived life, and I'm struck at how the Holy Spirit just wove together all of these pieces of your experiences so that you could strengthen whole communities. To me, that's the work of the church, and I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you. And I do think that that's the way I view, so here I am. What do I do? Not way back, but what do I do now? What is it may be a baby step, but what do we do? Or sometimes it's, but, and to bring up something that people are kind of reluctant to admit is the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When they honored you at the DDH board meeting that I was at, the comment was made, you might have been the one to make the comment, that when you first joined that board, you were the diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you were proud of, because of asking those pointed questions, because of being willing to name the things that everyone else thought was inappropriate to mention, that now that board is incredibly diverse in age and orientation and race in a whole bunch of ways.
Yes.
To me, that kind of is a reflection of what it means to ask those questions in the right spaces of the right people at the right times.
That's right. I really am proud of
Yes, you should be.
Being part of, because I'd forgotten, when I joined that board and late 80s.
That sounds right.
And you looked around the room, and most of the board members were alums, which meant that they were white and male, because that's the only kind of students that got to go to Chicago for many years. And how my husband Dave was a real pioneer when he went there.
He and William Fox both.
Yes, that's right. They always had that common tie about their lives. But it was to think of what that board was when I joined and what that board is now. I'm really proud of the part that I played in helping that evolve, because it's a really good board.
It is
now, and I'm sorry that I'm not going to be part of it. Now that I'm retired, maybe I'll have to.
It was your idea.
But because but I don't remember how many years I've been on that board, but it's been a long, long time, and I figured it was time to retire. Because I'm getting older, creakier. Not less sassy.